Okay, welcome everyone. Today it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker, César Soutullo Molina, from the University of Navarra. He gained his PhD 2 years ago with an investigation of Seleukid coinage and the imagery of monarchical power. From this PhD, he will also draw materials for his for today's presentation. He's been teaching various classical studies courses at the University of Navarra and also in Madrid. I think he also has some teaching experience in London. Well, the focus of his teaching is unsurprisingly numismatics, but also archaeology. And he's currently working on revising his thesis and translating it into English for publication. So my encouragement goes out to everyone in the audience. If you have some feedback that may go beyond this session, please be in touch with César. That's also one of our intentions with this group, that we share information and support each other's work. So César will soon give the presentation. I read the title, Images of Monarchical Power on the Coins from the Seleukid Kingdom. And I'm very pleased to have Dr. Deirdre Klokow with us today as the expert respondent. Well, I think most of us knew Deirdre at least since about the beginning of this lecture series, because she was one of the very first to join, and she also gave her first presentation in this series in June 2021, if I remember correctly, when she was still studying. I think you were then at Columbia University, although you were already a PhD student at the University of California in Los Angeles. By then, you completed and defended your PhD and have been appointed assistant professor at the University of Austin, Texas, and from where you are joining us today. Deirdre, as we all know, is an expert on all matters Seleukid. She contributed to the first Seleukid Perspectives Volume 1 study that shows her mastery of inscriptions, of landscape archaeology, and also of a variety of theoretical approaches to the ideology of the Seleukid dynasty. I also know that she's working on a study on Laodike III, a long-time study and a long-time shared interest between us. So I look forward to seeing that study completed as well. So thank you for joining us. Well, also to everyone in the audience. I must not forget to also extend cordial greetings from my co-host and friend, Dr. Rabbi Ben Skolnick, who is currently visiting Israel and cannot be with us. He might join briefly later on. Okay, César, the floor is yours. You'll start by sharing the screen.
Okay. Okay, it should look better now than when I show you earlier.
Yes, it looks perfect at my end.
Okay. So, the idea that ancient kingdoms had to appeal to the feelings of their subjects through images of power is not strange. We can see it in representations of the emperors of Rome in their literary documents. However, these traces of propaganda are more difficult to follow in the Kingdom of Macedon and in those who were born as a result of the death of Alexander the Great. See the kingdoms of the successors, or the Adoki. For dynasties like the Seleukids, it will be of great importance to create a propagandistic language to assert their power over an amalgam of subjects of the most diverse origins. Although we have not received as many testimonies as in the case of the Romans, we can find this kind of message in the monetary types, both on the overs and on the reverse side. It is particularly interesting to see how the vision that these same kingdoms have of themselves, particularly the ones that kings have and offer to their subjects, evolves as the needs of the monarchy changes according to their successes or failures. Okay. In my presentation, I will do an analysis of the usage of the image of Apollo and Zeus in the monetary issues of the Seleukid kingdom, and their evolution from the beginning of the monarchical monetary issues to the end of the kingdom at the hands of Rome. Also, I will try to shed some light on the question of how these coins were used for propagandistic purposes. Aside from this, I will try to show that the coinage of the Seleukid kingdom is not but a simple successor of what came with Alexander, but it lives in a tradition of symbols established long before the conquest of the Macedonian king. The Seleukids are, in my opinion, the ones that experimented the most with the different symbology and the images in the coinage, and this can be seen in the influence in the types of later regional powers like Parthia and even Rome. This is a map of the division of Alexander's empire at the height of the Battle of Ipsus, commonly known as the final battle between the armies of the successors. It shows the main kingdoms that will be actors in the political scene of the Hellenistic era. It would only be necessary to exclude the kingdom of Thrace and Lydia, ruled by Lysimachus, whose territories will be divided between Seleucus in Asia and Antigonus in Macedonia, after the Battle of Corupendius and the death of Seleucus. And this is just a quote from Plutarch that sums up the character of Diadochi very well, albeit from a somewhat negative perspective. Without a doubt, these are great generals of exorbitant ambition who will stop at nothing to achieve their goals. In relation to the reverses, I have identified at least 3 defining types of propaganda within the monetary issues. These types are not entirely exclusive, but often overlap on a single coin. And a single coin can therefore refer to several ideological values typical of the Seleukid propaganda. But for this representation, I will be focusing only on the first of one of these types. Okay. So Alexander, as the leader of the League of Corinth, is going to use the goddess of war with a Corinthian helmet next to the promised image of victory against the Persians in the Nike. In the silvers, we can see his claim to the divine blood of Heracles through his father on one side and the king of the gods on the other. These coins are going to serve as the main model for the deification of the successors. And this is just a little family tree I made for the Seleukids. And it's interesting to me because one thing that is particular of the Seleukid coinage is that you can see a representation of every king in the successive coins from Seleucus I. Well, not so much with Seleucus I, unless you take in consideration the coin I showed earlier, which I do, all the way to Antiochus XIII. In contrast, for example, with the Ptolemaic Egypt, which generally only shows Ptolemy I and sometimes some queens. These are the types that I will be talking about. As I said, I will be talking a little bit about the origins of the type and the cases in which those symbols live on after the fall of the Seleukids. In the coinage of the Arcadians, we can see the reclamation of Zeus as their titular protecting deity, going against the more commonly accepted version of Crete as the birthplace of Zeus. We can see as well the first examples of the usage of the type of the sitting Zeus, prior to Alexander choosing it for his tetradrachms. As Arcadia falls under control of the Macedonians, so does their type, now rebranded into an image of Hellenism against the Persians. And then we have the coinage of Mazeus in Persia. Is a really strange case of a usage of a Greek symbol, or at least something that closely resembles what the Greeks are using at the moment, but in an Eastern context during the conquest of the Achaemenid Empire. In any case, Mazeus is going to mint coins that show the Baal of Tarsus, because he was the satrap of Cilicia at the time, holding an eagle, which is very similar to what we see in the Alexander coins. This talks about the malleability of the symbols. On the other hand, even after the conquest of Alexander, he'll continue minting coins that show the Persian lion pouncing the Greek cow, which is completely baffling to me, but I don't know. I'm not a great expert in the Massius coinage, if I'm be honest. Okay, so going to the Nikephoros. The Nikephoros is directly inspired by the statue of Zeus in Olympia by Lysippos, but it is also a combination of the gold coins of the silver and the gold coins of Alexander, and the symbols that were usually portrayed on the metal, that being the Zeus and the Nike. Zeus, as the bearer of victory, is in charge of holding the feet of the fickle divinity so that she does not go anywhere, thus ensuring that the king and the Seleukid armies are always victorious in their battles. Legitimation through victory and personal prestige is pivotal when it comes to understanding the political ideology of the Hellenistic era. This type of representation, the elements shown on the coins and in the rest of propaganda, is determined by the type of kingdom that is the Hellenistic and particularly the Seleucid. A monarch who lives for war and who finds in war his reason for being and his legitimacy through his personal charisma and his ability to bring victory and wealth to his kingdom. This call to victory can be seen, for example, in the establishment by Antiochus I of a civic cult to the victorious figure of his father, in which he is adored as Zeus Nicator. On an interesting twist, it was Antigonus Monophthalmus who first minted the type in Antigonia, but just like Seleucus took the city and moved it to the other side of the Orontes, he's going to conquer the type and adopt it for his coins, just like Alexander conquered the Arcadian type with the eagle. The iconography or symbolism of Seleucus's coins is inherited from Alexander, but refers to his own exploits, not those of the king of Macedon. The importance of Zeus for Seleucus is not something groundbreaking, though, appearing in all of his mints, but rather it is something traditional for the kings of Macedon as the god of royalty. Nor can we leave aside the identification made at the time between Zeus and the Babylonian god Bel Marduk, nor the devotion of Seleucus to Zeus reflected in the coins and epigraphic records, which could reflect an initial need to conquer and establish his dominion under the auspice of a divine Babylonian protector. In fact, Van der Speck has argued that it is possible that the Greek worshipped Zeus in the temple of Bel Marduk in Babylon. Just as Marduk is associated with the rise of Babylon from city to empire and its ability to defeat its enemies and establish kingship, Seleucus also alludes to the connection between royalty and Zeus, as this god claimed his supremacy through combat in the heavens, which powerfully attract kings who, following the example of Alexander, used the figure of the heavenly monarch to ratify their sovereignty. To establish his right to reign, Seleucus calls upon Zeus for his ability to grant military victory, as evidenced by the broadcast of this type and his nickname of Nicator. Despite all of this and how important the Zeus is going to be for Seleucus, we're going to see how the type recedes in importance after his death. Even though he's like Antiochus I and Antiochus II and continuing from there are gonna still be minting this coin or this type rather. It's not up until to the age of Antiochus IV when we're gonna see a real resurgence of the Nikephoros Zeus, because prior to this the type is gonna give a lot of importance in favor of the sitting Apollo that we're gonna see later in this presentation. But then, of course, we all know about Antiochus IV and his project to use Zeus as a unifying figure for all the cults and religions of his kingdom. So that's the reason why Antiochus IV took the type again. And then after Antiochus IV, the type is gonna be important, at least for like his branch of the family. But then in the time of Antiochus VII, this type is gonna lose importance again in favor of Athena Promachos, which will be the main type, I think, of the dynasty up until the end of their time against Rome. Okay. As we can see, the types are going to continue being minted in Rome. Of special interest are the issues of Antoninus Pius and Hadrian, aside from other emperors, because these issues appear in the mints of Seleucia at Calicandum and Alexandria, respectively. Even though it's hard to assess the impact of the coins and their symbols, the permanence of the same kind of coin after so long speaks volumes, in my opinion. In the case of the Zeus Nikephoros, we can see that the Romans take it as well and use it in a very similar way to the Seleukids, and probably bearing a very similar meaning, even if the line between Zeus and Jupiter becomes really blurry. In respect to Apollo, there is an obvious relationship between Apollo and the city of Delphi and the oracle dimension of the god. Other cities will be showing similar types to the one that the Seleukids will eventually use. Of special interest, though, maybe, is the coin of Alexander I from Macedon, from the mint of Antiocheia, because this king was made into a vassal by the Persians during the Medic Wars, then fought against them after the Battle of Plataea and was eventually called a friend of the Greeks. And he is going to mint an image of Apollo with a bow, which indeed in that time was like very related to the image of the royal archer of the Persians. So this is a very early example of a similar type in Macedonian history that I only recently discovered, if I have to be honest, but I just find it very interesting that they would be showing such a similar type so early into the history of Macedonian coinage. Okay. So the story of the divine lineage of Seleucus is recorded in the works of Justin, in some epigraphical sources, but also in a little sample of coinage from his own range, from his own reign, although in the minority. It seems clear that the whole reclamation for a divine parentage comes from the time of Antiochus I. The use of a claim to a divine lineage is not particular to the Seleucids, but also successors will do the same to a greater or lesser extent. The fact that they want to be seen as children of the gods only reinforces the idea that their command is order and sanctioned from the heavens. Although Apollo is a Greek god, we can't forget the dimension and the importance of what an Eastern vision of the type could offer to the Seleukids. The people of the East believe that the king was the manifestation of the gods in the earth, and their election had to be sanctioned by the heavens. Apollo, being a solar god, is stemmed in a long Eastern tradition of sun gods protecting the kings. On the other hand, Erickson has spoken about the relationship between Apollo and Nabu in a sort of syncretism between the both of them. Along with the importance of solar gods for the Eastern folk, the justice gods are also going to be very important as well, in the shape of, again, Apollo and Nabu. In that sense, Apollo comes as more of a perfect selection to be the patron of the Seleukids. There is also a long-standing tradition of Macedonian coinage, in Macedonian coinage, of representing Apollo in relationship to horse imagery. See the coinage of Philip II, for example. This could mean that the type is somewhat of a throwback to the coinage of ancient Macedonian kings, although the limited appearance of the horse to mints like Ecbatana makes this harder to believe. At least when it comes to horses related to Apollo, that is, since there are other mints that show horses in the reverses. On the other hand, the relationship of Apollo with the horse could be a reference to the time in which Seleucus was the leader of the companion cavalry under Perdiccas after the death of Alexander, which could be arguably the kickstart to his political career. B, a celebration of the cavalry and its importance in the Hellenistic armies, it completely overshadowing the phalanx. Or C, a recognition of the quality of the Eastern nobility and their inclusion in the Seleukid images of power, as in a king that rules over such powerful forces and masters them to reach victory. We also have an obvious dichotomy of the father and son relationship between Zeus and Apollo, and between Seleucus and Antiochus. I will briefly talk about the importance of Didyma and Mileto and their oracles to the Seleukids, although in my opinion those are probably later constructions, seeing how the kings would often offer their vergesia to such kind of sanctuaries in exchange of receiving what they wanted, that being some sort of directed sanctioning to their rule. In any case, the selection of Apollo seems to have been more than deliberate, the image combining the most Greek of the gods with some sort of allusion to the Achaemenid heritage through the image of the royal archer. On another dimension, we have the fact that Apollo is the patron of colonizers, the foundation of cities that vertebrate the large territory of his kingdom is going to be one of the defining factors of the policy of Antiochus I, not only in Syria but all over the kingdom. In respect to the representation shown in the coins, sometimes the god will appear naked, sometimes draped around the waist. This talks of a slightly changed image directed to different audiences, that being the Greeks or the Eastern people. The omphalos that appears in the vast majority of the coinage of this type refers to the kind of predestined power, or at least to the power coming with the approval of the oracles. The bow and the arrows are going to appear in different ways. Sometimes Apollo appears holding the bow as if he was getting ready to fight, while other times he rests on it while testing the arrows. In any case, the relation of this image with the Persian royal archer is more than obvious. And well, about the history of the type, as I said, it appears during Antiochus I, well, in Seleukid contest at least. It appears during the time of Antiochus I, and is going to be used all over the reigns of every king up until Antiochus IV, where, as I said before, he's going to substitute it with the image of the Nikephoros Zeus. Although it is interesting because in the time where Antiochus IV ascended to the throne, it seems like there was a child son of I think Seleucus IV, or at least the brother of Antiochus IV, which was supposed to be the legitimate ruler. So every time we see Apollo or most of the times that we see Apollo in the coinage of Antiochus IV, we see it with the overs showing the image of a child, which possibly is this child that never came up to be king, because I think he was assassinated. So yeah. We have a couple of important variations of the Seleukid Apollo. On one side, the standing Apollo that is minted during the time of Seleucus II, which is interesting in the context of a king strife with his brother in Anatolia. Why should he opt for a new image if he was the legitimate ruler when Hierax was minting the sitting Apollo? Well, standing figures usually are more archaic, perhaps throwing back to a pastime of greater stability. Or perhaps he just wanted to differentiate himself from the pretender by creating a new image of power of his own. In any case, both of his sons, Seleucus III and Antiochus III, will go back to the more classic sitting Apollo. On the other hand, we have the Cithar Apollo, which is probably alluding to a different, more peaceful portrayal of the god, being that the type appears in the time of Antiochus II. Perhaps he was referencing to Apollo as a culture god, just as his father Antiochus I defended Anatolia from the Galatians, and so received the name of Soter. So that's my idea about the Cithar Apollo. And then I should also make a brief mention to a very similar type that shows Archer Artemis, and the dichotomy of Apollo King and Artemis Queen, which is going to be shown in some coinage of the Seleukids, mostly in the time of Antiochus III and Antiochus IV, because I think they were married to their sisters. And if they weren't married to their sisters, at least they just made it come through as if they were their sisters. And this is very interesting as well, because there is the same relationship with between Nabu and Nanaya, which only reinforces the idea of Erickson of there actually being some sort of syncretism between Apollo and Nabu. And then we can see the successor of the Archer Apollo type in the replacing regional power, that being the Parthians. Even if they aren't really portraying the Greek Apollo in their coins, instead showing the classic Persian archer, the resemblance is more than striking. In the case of the Romans, even if the coins don't show the exact same type, the archer imagery is still there. So we can see that the impact of the Seleukid coins is more than I don't know, visible in the kingdoms that came after them. And all that be it.
So you have reached your end?
Yeah.
So thank you very much. That came quite quick, but it was a wonderful survey to an important imagery, and Deirdre is now prepared to give some feedback. Thank you very much.
Hi, thank you for that. Very interesting paper. Thanks, Alte, for bringing me back here to speak again. I think it's so useful and thought-provoking for us to have all of these examples put together and contextualized like this. This is a great time to work on Hellenistic numismatics. It's really flourishing. There's so many new avenues for research that are opening up all the time. And as we sort of get drawn into pathways for the study of coinage, having to do with, really detailed questions of dating and things like this, which we often like to pursue, I think it's good to take a step back and look at these larger questions of iconography, and particularly how they impact our understanding of kingship in the Seleukid period, which is constantly evolving and developing. So I want to touch on a couple of things that I got from reading the research that I was sent and from listening to you talk today. I think one of the big questions that we always have to ask ourselves when we study iconography on coinage is the question of royal control and audience. Who do we think is controlling the image on these coinage? How much oversight we think the king, or maybe we would better say sort of royal administration, has over variants and details in different regions, and how much that level of control would differ in, for instance, the case of precious metal coinage versus the sort of lower value bronze coinage, where we often see a higher preponderance of local imagery and text. So that's something I'd love to hear your thoughts on. I'm also interested in what you had to say about early influences on Macedonian and Seleukid coinage. I work on the Persians a little bit. It's something I'm really fascinated with. And I would suggest that indeed the development of Macedonian coinage from a very early period is deeply influenced by Persian iconography, particularly the development of the Apollo imagery, which really harkens back, as you say, to this image of the Persian king as an archer figure. I mean, we have this not just in imagery, but in royal inscriptions as well. Sort of Darius going around saying things like, as an archer, I am an excellent archer, right? It's a deeply embedded ideal for Persian kingship. And I think this comes out in Macedonian coinage. And it also becomes so important, as you mentioned, for the early days of the Seleucid Empire as well. And likewise, sort of going off of this development, I think it's interesting how quickly we see the Seleukid types moving away from this kind of conscious emulation of the Alexander coinage very early, right? And we talk about, for instance, the coinage of Lysimachus, which really hews very closely to the sort of Alexander types. The Ptolemies, for whom Alexander types are deeply important on the coinage. And then we have the Seleukids doing something totally different, right? Moving very far away from this kind of conscious emulatio Alexandri, this imitation of Alexander types. And I've always wondered about how we interpret that when it comes to thinking about the use of the Apollo types in particular, because unfortunately for the Seleukids, Alexander is so embedded in so many male religious figures in the Greek pantheon, right? He's associated closely with Zeus and the Zeus Ammon figure. He's also associated with Dionysus. So looking for a male figure to associate dynastic rule with, that's not going to be constantly living in the shadow of Alexander is something that's difficult, I think, for them. And drawing on this Apollo imagery, I think, is really significant when we come to think about how the Seleukid dynasty is trying to separate themselves from Macedonian iconography and this sort of shadow that Alexander casts in places like Babylon, where he is indeed so embedded in the recent history. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about what you think about that. I do want to hear a little bit more about your ideas concerning Antiochus IV and his relationship with the Zeus coinage. I know you mentioned that briefly early on, and it was in the paper that I read as well. And I know you seem to be interested in this idea about Antiochus using the worship of Zeus to sort of unite the fractured regions of the empire under a sort of pan-imperial centralized cult. And this is, of course, an idea that had a lot of attraction for previous scholars who sort of thought that this kind of religious and cultural centralization was a really necessary component of a strong state, right? And that its absence is of necessity a weakness for the Seleukids, not having this kind of centralization. But I think a lot of us would argue now that this kind of centralization and unification is not really applicable to the kind of diverse and flexible state that the Seleukids create, which thrives quite well as polycentric and multicultural, as did the Achaemenids before them. I think a push towards this kind of centralization might be slightly out of character for them. They fit so well into this Achaemenid model of chameleon kings, as we call them. And I'm not sure that the evidence really supports this interpretation for Antiochus IV. The appearance of Zeus on the coinage of Antiochus IV definitely is a break, and we do have a lot of evidence for him prioritizing temples of Zeus, right? He clearly has a personal association with the god that's significant. But I do wonder what you think about the suggestions that, for instance, the celestial imagery on the coinage of Antiochus IV in the East can be read as associating him with a kind of version of Apollo as a solar god, right? A solar deity, which would sort of presume that Apollo remains really central as a religious association for the Seleukids in the eastern half of the empire, and that the presence of Zeus in the West on the coinage of Antiochus IV is related instead to historical context. These coins seem to be intended for circulation in the newly conquered region of Coele-Syria. And we know that the Seleukids are pushing for a sort of light touch here in regions where Ptolemaic coinage has been the standard, right? Oftentimes dynastic messages are not the only message being put forward by coinage. There's also the question of legitimacy, right? And the need for troops and peoples to just accept this coinage. So I wonder, those are really big, broad questions, sorry. but I'd like to hear what you
it's
have to say about them. And I do have some other stuff, but maybe we can talk about this and then we can see what people think and come back to other questions if we feel like it. Does that sound good?
Yeah, no, it sounds perfect. Yeah, I can give you a answer to most of them, or at least I'll try. So in relationship to the control of their king over the coinage, I'm inclined to believe that well, probably in the beginning, there was more of a control of over the images shown, especially in the high value, especially like in silver and in gold. Because you can see, for example, in the overses, the image of the king evolving, and it goes from Seleucus, for example, which I think you can still see, which is mostly idealized and changed into the image of a hero like Heracles in the case of the Alexander coins. But then you can see, for example, in Antiochus the First and Antiochus the Second and Third, you can see how the image of the king evolves towards more of a realistic reflection of the king. For example, in Antiochus the Third, where he came to the crown, or the throne rather, 17 or 18 years old, you can see how he gets progressively bolder in the emissions. So in my opinion, there was quite the control over those kind of coins. Maybe not so much over the reverses, because I feel like probably once they tested Apollo and it seems to work, they will probably just go with it. For example, we can see Seleucus the Third and Antiochus the Third just completely scratching the idea of his father. In my opinion, it's just like, oh, maybe this is not gonna work. Let's go back to what everyone knows. And well, then I'll talk about the how do you call it? Like the return to Zeus, because you made an entire other question about that. But then, for example, when you take the Athena Promachos in the time of Antiochus the Seventh, he's just showing an image of gold of his hometown, or well, not maybe his hometown, but nearby. So, like for example, imagine if someone from New York minted a coin of the Statue of Liberty, it would be perfectly normal for everyone. In the case of the low value, I feel like there was probably not a lot of control, and even then in the age of Antiochus IV, he actually gives control to the cities of Cilicia in the way of mint whatever you want and just don't rebel. Just please don't rebel. Like you can see that in the coins of that show very Cilician types. Like for example, there is this type that shows like a funerary how do you call it, like funerary statuette or something, like where you would burn an image of a god in a civic rite. I think I can show it actually. I'll show it in a bit when I stop. I mean, I'll just look for it and show it. Well, if other people have questions, I just have a moment to search for it. But yeah, for example, in Cilicia, we're gonna see like how the control of the, not even the low values, the high values, like the silvers are gonna show whatever they wanted, because like Antiochus just wanted that flank of the kingdom to be secure while he focused on the, well, Coele Syria and then his project of reconquering the east. In the case of the early Macedonian coinage, I feel like the best example is again the horse, and then and also Apollo, because you see Apollo in the representations of the overses of the Macedonian kings up until Philip II, I think. They always show Apollo most of the time, and then in the reverse you can see the horses. And then the Seleukids, for example, are gonna show a lot of they are gonna have a lot of horse imagery in their coins, mainly during Seleucus the First, when I think that they were trying to test the grounds and see which type stick better with the population. Well, not even with the population, but maybe just with the armies. And they were showing horses and hornet horses, for example, all the time, and bulls and other things. But I feel like the horse is the best example of the early Macedonian coinage, even before Alexander, in the coinage of the Seleukids. Or maybe it's just, as I said, maybe it's just like an allusion to when Seleucus first comes into the political scene of the era, because before he was just, he was the commander of the royal shield bearers, which, as much as it may be a place or a position of honor in the armies, as I said, infantry is most of the time just left for low-ranking officers, and you don't see a lot of things told about in the literary sources about the infantry during battles, because most of the time they just focus in the action. Like, for example, in Gaugamela, you see how Alexander is doing his thing and going around the Persian army to capture Darius, and meanwhile the phalanx is not really. The phalanx is just staying there, doing their thing. It's just men with long sticks, so they usually don't appear that much in the literary sources, and not even in the coinage. Like the greatest allusion to infantry in the coinage, aside from this coin we're seeing about the Nike crowning a trophy, which would most of it always be erected in the place where one of the phalanxes retreated. Aside from that, you get it's not the Argead sun, but it's a similar symbol to the Argead, or like the son of the Macedonian kings, which sometimes it was. They say, I'm not totally sure, but I think they were embossed or painted or whatever in the Macedonian shields. So it's not a lot about the infantry there, but the cavalry is the important. So you see horses all the time, and maybe an influence of that is the apparition of elephants after that, because elephants are gonna be very important for the Seleukids, especially in the beginning. For example, in the Battle of Ipsus, they just basically won the battle by themselves. So I feel like that the influence of the early Macedonian coinage can be seen, for example, in the military forces being represented in the coinages, especially in the reverses. And aside from that, I don't know a lot about early Macedonian coinages, but that's very clear to me that the apparition, and then maybe the Apollo that I showed earlier, I refuse to believe it's just a coincidence, even though it's not there are not a lot of examples of that type of Alexander the First being minted. So yeah, I feel like that is the most important influence of the early Macedonian coinage in the Seleukids. And then about the farther from the Seleukids, from Alexander imagery, to me is totally normal, because we have to understand the position of the Seleukids in the political scene of the time. For example, you have Ptolemy, which was basically Alexander's cousin, and he snatched the body of Alexander and took it to Egypt. So of course he's just gonna have and he claimed to be son of Philip II. So just a great source of legitimacy there. Then Lysimachus is just gonna be minting the same things, but we don't know what Lysimachus would have done in the future, because he literally got killed 5 years after Ipsus, I think. And then you have the coinage of the Antigonids, which is gonna change a bit especially during the time of Antigonus I and especially Demetrius Poliorcetes. But then when they go back to Macedonia, when Antigonus Gonatas conquers Macedonia, he's just gonna be back to minting the same thing as before. Not the same thing as Alexander, but more of a recognizable types. Because again, he's just living in Macedon. He lives in Macedon. He's saving from the Celts. He doesn't need like to invent anything because like people just recognize him as the king. But the Seleukids, like for example, as I said, Seleucus was we don't honestly know if he was a great friend of Alexander or if they were close together. He was just the leader of the royal shield bearers. Then when after Babylon, they selected Perdiccas to be like the steward of the children, well, not the children, but the heirs of Alexander, even though Philippus Arrideus didn't need a steward. It's just like we're led to believe that he was just a silly heir, so nobody wanted him as a king. Seleucus goes forth and actually kills Perdiccas. So there's like, okay, you're just ramping up more sources of legitimacy on top of each other. So you need to build the legitimacy yourself. So he doesn't have the body of Alexander. He doesn't rule over Macedonians. He killed the legitimate successor of Alexander. So the only thing for him is just to conquer the prestige and the legitimacy by himself. So he goes ahead and conquers the entire East and becomes a thorn in the edge, in the side, of Antigonus for all of his life up until the end. And then we could say arguably Seleucus is the one that kills Antigonus because it's the elephants that cover the cavalry, and then his archers probably were the ones that kill Antigonus, although maybe there's just a construction to make Seleucus look even like more important. But in the time, it's just like he didn't have nothing and he just created all from scratch. So at that point, in my opinion, there is not a lot of reason for him to just grab the types of Alexander and reuse them, because he's not Alexander, he's just a new thing, even though he steps on top of the legacy of Alexander. Like you can see that in the overs of this coin. Like most of the people that have seen this coin think that is just a representation of Alexander. But in my opinion, there is no reason for us to believe that is Alexander, because like for example, the bull horns, are not part of Alexander's imagery. The panther skin on the helmet, we don't see that many cases of Alexander other than the blanket of panther skin that they say he was using on Bucephalus, and then sure the lion skin, like the panther skin around his neck, sure it's an allusion to the lion skin of Heracles, but again it's just simply something completely new. So in my opinion, it's just a representation of Seleucus, and no reason for us to believe that it's Alexander, because as I said, Seleucus just had to do everything from scratch and create a new image of himself to just sell to people that, okay, I'm not Alexander, but I basically did the same, and I conquered the same kingdom as him, and I'm gonna become the new king. And then in relation to Antiochus IV usage of Zeus, well, I feel like he was trying to make an association with Seleucus I again, and just try to go back to the old coinage of Seleucus I. Like for example, sure there were some kings before Antiochus IV that had titles related to battle, but none of them actually took the Nike or Nicator or Nikephoros. When for example, Antiochus IV took the title of Nikephoros. You have Callinicus, and you have Keraunos, and of course Antiochus III the Great, but none of them use the Nike in their royal titles. Then we have the case of Antiochus IV probably being a usurper, because of what I spoke earlier about the child that was destined to be king, but he didn't get the crown in the end, or the diadem rather. So if they were minting the Apollo types for the child, maybe he just was like, okay, I'm gonna make these coins for myself, and then I'm like administering the kingdom or managing the kingdom up until this child comes of age. But it was obvious he was never gonna let that happen. So he just wanted to create a new image of legitimacy for himself. And then it's just, I feel like when Antiochus IV comes into the well, rises to the throne, or whatever you want to call it, I feel like there was not the time for subtleties anymore. They just needed something strong after the defeat of Antiochus III in Magnesia, and they needed something to push back the Persians and the influence of Rome. Well, not the Persians, but the Parthians, and the influence of Rome in the East. So in my mind, there is none less subtle god than Zeus. He's just the king of kings, and that is what he wants, to be the king of kings again. And then again, for example, Apollo, if Apollo is having a strong ties to the image of the Parthian, well, not the Parthian, the Persian royal archer, a lot of people in the Syria, which are most of like the biggest audience for the high value coins, are not gonna be very happy if they see like the royal, well, they probably didn't see the royal archer, right? If they see an archer, and the archers or the Parthians are the ones that are pushing them the harder at the moment, they are not gonna be very happy about that. So maybe they just wanted like something more Greek at the moment, that also could like unify the different cults. Because sure, as we see, for example, like we can see the Zeus with the eagle, which the eagle is going to be very important for Antiochus IV as well, after he conquered Coelesyria. It's just the same image as what they see in the Baal of Tarsus. It's just old man holding an eagle. Sure, you want that to be Zeus, you want that to be Baal, you want that to be Marduk. And then again, we don't know how much the people cared in the time, because like there is not such a concept of inflation. You just have the weight of the coin. It shows something that resembles something I like, I'll go with it. And I feel like the Hellenistic kings, especially the Seleukids, will be exploiting that. And then, as I said, yeah, as they conquer the Ptolemy territories, and they were conquering people that were less exposed to Apollo, maybe the image of Zeus was more attractive as a unifying factor, instead of Apollo, which would be just like, oh, we conquered you, now have these coins, the coins of the guys that conquered you. So yeah, that would be my opinions on the whole swapping to Zeus by Antiochus IV. And I hope I
Thank
answered
you.
your questions.
Yeah, those are good answers. I do think the Zeus imagery for Antiochus IV has a lot of Ptolemaic sort of echoes and callbacks that are important to keep in mind, because the eagle, for instance, huge on Ptolemaic coinage, right? So I do think there's like a legitimacy thing happening in these previously Ptolemaic.
Yeah, like for example, in this eagle coin, they just started minted eagles in their I think that's a rivers, in the rivers after the conquest of Coelesyria, because they just to me it's just like they conquered the type. Like it's no longer, I mean, the Ptolemaics are gonna keep using it, but the same way they conquer the region, they conquer the type and use it. So
yeah, and it's also, it's interesting to think about how that's playing out regionally as the sort of Seleukid control is being pushed outward, and I think it tells us a lot about the sort of reception of Seleukid authority in these regions, right? They're like, fine, let's continue with this Ptolemaic imagery. As you say, they sort of take on that type for themselves and show that flexibility. But Alte, I don't know, do you want to open it up? Do you want me to keep babbling?
Thank you very much to both of you. I would say we can happily open it up. I too have some musings of my own, but these can wait. If anyone else would like to share some comments or ask questions, please come forward. We're a small group, so just give it a try. I hear someone is trying to unmute, but I do not yet see anyone.
It's
well, in the
Susan.
meantime, oh, Susan, yes, please.
Yes. Okay. I have done extensive work on Antiochus III, or Seleucus I, and Antiochus I, and Alexander III, and not Alexander. Antiochus III. I'm sorry, I'm on pain pills. I'm having dental surgery tomorrow, so I'm a little crazy. And my belief is that Antiochus I started changing from the Alexander III portraits to his own portrait. He and silver and used the ram horns as a method of honoring his father after his death. And they were mostly on gold and silver coins of the period. And then as he progressed to bronze, he started to build his own portrait on the obverse and used a variety of horses and Zeus. Well, he started using Zeus, and then Antiochus III really moved into having his own coinage, doing his own thing. And I think that his son, Antiochus IV, just really took it to the next level. And I find this really fascinating. This is really my idea of a good time. And I really appreciate your paper. Thank you.
no, thank you. Yeah, I totally agree with that. There is also the difference between the coins that were minted in the mints of Babylon during the age of Alexander, and then after the death of Alexander, when Seleucus takes the satrapy of Babylon, even though we can still see the symbols of Alexander, like Zeus, the eagle, and whatever, we can see how progressively these types start to mutate, not only in the case of the inclusion of the Nike, but also in the inclusion of the anchor blazon in most of the coins. Well, not in most of the coins, and not even only in the main types as the Zeus, for example, but also in the types that are more resembling of, well, for example, like a walking lion, which would be like a very civic minting, even though it was minted in silver. You can still see how the lion goes from just walking to actually turning around and looking at the anchor. So that's extremely interesting to me. And then you can see this be even more of a thing when you compare the minting of coins between the western side of the kingdom in Syria and so forth, with the coins that are going to be minted in the territories administered by Antiochus I in the east after he was made the co-king. I think it was after Ipsus, or maybe not. I'm not sure. But yeah, it's the mutation of the types after the death of Alexander, and then after Antiochus actually becomes like co-king of Seleucus is very interesting. Yeah.
So he became co-king in 296. I think the year is now established. In only a few years ago, he was well, it was suggested sometime between 294 and 292 BCE, but Johannes Hackel has recently presented Babylonian evidence which make it quite clear that his appointment as co-king, and going along also with the remarriage of Stratonike, and then the appointment to the Eastern satrapies dates to 296. That is 5 years after Ipsos. Just to specify that. Well, I am not so familiar with iconography, coinage, and iconography in general. I actually thought, remembering from Kyle Eriksson's presentation here, which then was developed into a paper in Seleukid Perspectives 1, is that we should now date the Alexander coinage of Seleucus I a little earlier, to the satrapal period, if I remember that correctly, and that would then eliminate Alexander issues after Seleucus assumed the title of king. Does anyone know whether I am remembering that correctly? So that would then somehow contrast or conflict with the longer or a later reuse of Alexander imagery. And even I'm not sure, I do not remember the Ammon horns on Antiochus I's coinage, so that would be quite odd. I would not see how that would honor his own father Seleucus. So that's something I would need to learn a little bit, know or understand more about to integrate that into the picture. What I can contribute, however, is because César, you mentioned the Soter ideology, and you repeated the traditional view that this well, is a close connection, or represents a close connection with the defeat of the Galatians. We have earliest evidence of the Soter ideology after the defeat of Lysimachos, when Seleucus was still alive. Even though, so the Soter ideology, Apollo Soter, and Soter cults for Seleucus and Antiochus, they date to 281 so that predates the arrival of the Galatians. But at some point in the collective memory, the Soter ideology promoted by Antiochus, the Soter, also called Antiochus Apollo Soter in the inscription of the priest of the dynastic priests of Seleukia and Pieria, leaves it somehow open when and how the Galatian motif was bound in. And there is some dispute in scholarship whether our earliest evidence still to the glorification of the elephant victory over the Galatians dates back to Antiochus I, or rather is as late as Antiochus III. So there is a lot of controversy and uncertainty in our evidence, but not about the time when the first Soter ideology is connected with Antiochus and Apollo. So that comes a little earlier. But that does not undermine anything else that you have said. So the shift away from Zeus to Apollo for the new dynasty, and some innovation already under Seleucus, who stuck to Zeus as the main deity, but then the increasing importance of Apollo, I've tried to relate that to the growing connection between the Seleukid court and the Milesians well, shortly after Ipsos. And only after Ipsos, I argue, that connection began. Everything, all the legendary stuff that you also mentioned as later fabrication, César, I fully agree. And I even go as far as to say that Demades from Miletos did not have Demodamas, I think, if I remember his name correctly, started a connection only after Ipsos, and then we see some an increase of honors and benefactions, and before the end of Seleucus I, after the death of Lysimachus, that seems to have been culminating in a much closer or much more greater importance of Apollo for the dynasty, and then it completely flew with the new imagery on the coinage of Antiochus the first. Is it 277, 276 when we first see Apollo on the omphalos on the reverse of Antiochus's coinage? So that's how I try to bring the pieces together, but the picture is far from complete, and so still some fine-tuning needs to be done with the pieces that have been mentioned by you and by Susan as well. Anyone who wants to say something to this, or? I would have another point, but I would, well, jump by 1 century again into the time of Antiochus IV. When you mention the child represented on the coinage of Antiochus IV, I understood you as understanding the child as representation of Apollo, rather, but you did mention the connection with the son of Seleucus IV, also and Antiochus. Now I think it's now widely accepted in Houghton and Law, but also in articles that Ben has written, and everything that I've looked at, that the coinage that shows the child probably predate the arrival of Antiochus IV in Antioch. And so they date very early after the death of Seleucus IV. Together with we have the child, and we have also coinage of his mother. I think it's a double portrait or Jugate portrait on one issue, and if I do remember, but I hope I'm not conflating that with Laodike III here. Deirdre, you can help me. Do we also have Laodike IV, whether it's 4A, 4B, on her own in the early phase of the dynastic succession after the death of Seleucus the Fourth? So that would question the idea that this might be Apollo, and it would be very surprising to have Apollo represented for the very first time on Seleukid coinage as a child, because he's always been a young man. So
no,
that...
I didn't I think you, or maybe I just expressed it wrong, but I was saying that the coinage, the overses were showing the image of the child that is gonna be usurped by Antiochus IV.
Okay, then
it's gonna be shown in the overses, and in the reverses we're gonna see the Apollo, the sitting Apollo. And then when Antiochus IV comes, he just shows himself in the overs, and then Zeus mainly in the reverse. So yeah, that maybe I just expressed it wrong. Sorry.
No, then probably I got this wrong. Then we are still in full agreement with perhaps the nuance that remains that Antiochus IV was not yet in charge of anything at the court when the issue with the child or with the child and his mother occurred, and very quickly then they were actually relegated from the imagery, and it was that now Antiochus IV, although the child remained co-ruling king until his murder in 170. It's a very dubious period. Very interesting things to say about that, but that would just affect.
Maybe it's just a case of the coins that they have, that the Seleukid court had the time to mint from the moment that Seleucus IV dies to the moment in which Antiochus IV comes back from Rome. Maybe they have had some time to mint some coins with the image of the child king, because as we saw, as I have stated, like you see this evolution towards more realistic portraits of the kings. For example, in Antiochus III, see how he gets bolder. So maybe they were just minting the coinage of the child. And I'm trying to find the veiled image of the woman that you were alluding. I think it was Laodike IV, but I don't see Laodike III. And even then I hope you can see it, but
yes.
But this would be Laodike IV. I don't know all about that much about the coins of Laodike III. She was important in the time of Antiochus III, but aside from some bronzes, for example, and the images of Artemis that I alluded, I don't know about the coinage we were mentioning now.
If I can jump in on that, I think I wanted to ask you actually what you think about the development of the Artemis imagery, how it relates to the use of Apollo, and also how it relates to the sort of rising prevalence of figures like Laodike III in this period. And we have that so many great bronzes showing Artemis, and there's that one from, I think, Susa, showing what is maybe a female figure in an elephant headdress. Very strange. I wonder if you have any thoughts on that.
There are some coinage of females in carriages in the early mintings of Seleucus the First. He shows Athena on a biga, or like basically a carriage pulled by elephants. He also shows the Nike in the same kind of image. The development of Artemis is, in my opinion, is just gonna be parallel to the development of Apollo. Obviously, a bit overshadowed, but such were the times. And for example, you have Antiochus III, Antiochus IV are gonna start to show more of like the importance of the queens in the court. Or maybe it's just because we know more about these kings than, for example, Seleucus III, who actually didn't have time to do anything. So, in my opinion, the development of Artemis in the Seleukid coins is like an allusion to this sort of relationship with Apollo as her being the sister, and also showing a very similar imagery to what we see in Apollo, because obviously when Apollo is an archer, Artemis is also an archer, but she's a female figure. So you can see that this totally off the rails, because it doesn't have anything to do, but like when you see this Roman formula from when they got married, is like, I think it's ubi ubi tu caius ego caia. So it's like where you are this, I'll be the same thing. So the female or the queen is just gonna be the queen, the consort of the king, but it's also treated as his sister. And like you can see it in the coins of Artemis, and like you can see, if I can find it actually, because it's a very bad version of my thesis. But you can see it's basically showing the same image of Artemis. I mean, the same image that we see in the coinage of Apollo is we're gonna see the same in Artemis, just an archer. So in my opinion, it's just that development of just showing Artemis in the same light of the Apollo. Here, where is it? No, this is not the right one. And then the real kickstart, or like the real figure that we're gonna see in the coinage, alluding to females, is obviously gonna be Cleopatra Thea. This one is the archer Artemis. I hope you can see it. Yeah, she's holding a bow, but it's basically the same thing as we see with the Apollo. It's just a female instead. It's also interesting because she bears like a torch, which I quite couldn't put my finger on what that was representing, aside from some kind of maternal figure, protecting figure in the night or something, but like I couldn't really get more of that. And then we have Cleopatra Thea, which is gonna be shown in the syllabus, and it's gonna be like the real important female figure of the Seleukid kingdom. So important in the case of her being shown in the coinage. I think this is her. Yeah, it's gonna be like the greatest development in the female representation in Seleukid coinage is just the apparition of Cleopatra Thea. But then again, she's like such a big figure in the court of the moment that I'm not really surprised that they would actually start representing her instead. Because like at the time there were not a real clear successor to the king's to the Seleukid throne, and she was completely took over.
Thank you.
I would actually look forward to writing something about Cleopatra Thea. She's such an interesting figure in the time, and I think that more could be investigated about her. But
I agree, and her coinage is interesting. She has so many different reverse types that she uses. It's very flexible coinage. So yeah, I think Kathy Lorber is actually doing something on Cleopatra Thea right now. So I'm sure that will be very brilliant and illuminating.
So regarding Cleopatra Thea, on the one hand, of course, you have the Egyptian Ptolemaic influence clearly there, but there is also the continuity from the Seleukid perspective, because females, that is queens, basilicai, they became particularly important when dynastic succession was at stake and was questioned or was problematic. And we have, well, a very intensive phase of dynastic challenges amongst the sons of Antiochus III, when one might wonder, why was that not already the case when we had earlier succession crises? But then no one did have the idea to use the portraits of queen mothers or wives on the coinage. But this happened first with Laodike III and then Laodike IV. So being the glue between different generations, and that, well, most obviously later became Cleopatra IV. There, I think her role is mostly that of being the glue between the next kings. When she was trying to rule in her own right, she was not very successful as as we know, she was forced to have a son by her side, and so yeah, it did not end very well for her to try to rule in her own name. I know not everyone likes that, and I don't want to defend that. I'm just trying to to understand that, and it's important to understand the roles that kings and queens had in their time. I would like to come back to, I think it was Deirdre's first comment, trying to understand better the whole communication context in which we place the coins. So from not just from the perspective of the issuer, but also of the receiver, of the audience, and how that communication took place. And you made some very fresh remarks, César. And I have lots of sympathies, thinking that very often many of the audience did not care very much, as if only they trusted in the value, in the material value. On the one hand, on the other hand, I can imagine some audience to really admire a beautifully carved coin, especially in a precious metal. And even those who would care less, over the time, they would get accustomed to certain imagery, and that imagery might still have an ideological impact. So it's a very, very fluid and very very evasive communicative context. But within that context, I found most interesting your comments on Antiochus IV, when you said, well, he completely left it to the locals to choose their imagery. And I'm not sure. I'm not sure how far I can follow. Of course, we all think of the so-called pseudo-autonomous coinage, and especially the Phoenician cities, but also in Cilicia, we see ever more local cult representation. I wonder, what evidence do we have to say it is either the king allowing the locals to issue coinage with image that they chose themselves, or it's rather the king choosing some local images, knowing that certain local cults were very popular, choosing deliberately those cults to flatter, but without losing any control. So I'm not fully decided, and I phrased these two options deliberately, a little bit radically, and the truth may well have been somewhere in between, and not necessarily actually the same in every single case. And even at later stages, we have pseudo-autonomous coinage, and sometimes we wonder, or is it autonomous at the time? So I wonder how that communication may actually have taken place. Who were the stakeholders? With whom would the king or his courtier, his treasurer, actually have these communications? Have you given any thought to this? And I have not. I'm just trying to understand this, because the project of Seleukid Perspectives 1 try to push our attention towards the question of audience, and to see the importance of other agents in the ideological discourse other than only the king and his courtiers, but seeing everything much more in a continuum of communication, of seeing, hearing, receiving ideas, but then adding and modifying and sending back messages. And so having this kind of dialectic discourse, which I think plays an important role in any ideological discourse. And so I wonder how we can translate that to the choice of coin imagery.
I mean, obviously, with the communication in the age, you have to accept that some things were very limiting, especially in a kingdom of the size of the Seleukids. So, for example, in the central area of the Seleukids, that would be the Tetrapolis in Syria, they would have quite a lot. I would assume they would have quite a lot of control in which things were minted, or which symbols were minted rather. And as I said, I think that after establishing the image, they would be happy to just let it mutate as long as it kept somewhat similar. For example, we have where is it? Here. The Apollo, the sitting Apollo that shows a horse. This only happens in Ecbatana, maybe in Susa. It's just, it seems like the person that was minting the coin, he has had the idea to add the horse. And in my opinion, there was not really a lot of communication to like between the mint and the king in the sense of, do you want this in the coin? I feel like that would be like, oh, you're showing Apollo, you're showing a horse. Sure. I don't feel like there was a lot of discussing in that, because you can see there's a lot of different symbols that appear every now and then in the Seleukid coins, and then they don't appear again. So it's just like maybe they are showing their national or like their cultural heritage in one specific coin. And I don't think that the Seleukid kings, even though they were probably not informed about that, I don't think they would have any problem with that at the moment, because like, sure, they were rulers over foreign people, but they don't want to like assert their dominance all over, and it's just a horse in a coin, so it's not gonna be something that insults. It's not like for example, the where is it? Like the Mazeus coin. It's literally the Persian lion eating the Greek cow. So that would come more insulting for the people in the era. So it's not, or not the people in the era, but like the Greeks in the era. So it's baffling to me that they would allow him to keep minting those coins. But in the case of the Seleukids, it's like, I feel like as long as they were showing the symbols, like the main aspects of what the Seleukids wanted to be in the coins, they would be just happy to have the locals add whatever they wanted. And for example, this happens as well in the overseas, and like only happens for in the case of you have usually the king represented with a diadem, but then in the case of Antiochus I in Alexandria in Troas, I think, he just all of a sudden he appears with a winged diadem from the king Hermes, and there is no reason for that other than people seem to there seem to be a local cult to Hermes in the city, and they just decided that the king looked good with a winged diadem, and the king must have seen it. Well, hopefully he saw it, and he just thought that nothing really wrong with showing me with Hermes attributes if they are showing me with the diadem. Like they are recognizing me as a king, so they want to add their own kind of twist to the coin. As long as it's actually showing what I want, I don't think they actually care that much about controlling the ultimate aspects of the coin. Is also because they really didn't have the like, they couldn't be everywhere all the time. So most of the time you would have Antiochus I or Antiochus III, they would be in the front lines. They cannot really be micromanaging the coinages in the far fringes of the kingdom. So for example, so all of a sudden the king appears with the winged diadem. Okay, it's a diadem, so they can actually they couldn't factually micromanage that. So as long as the king was recognizable in the coins, I don't think there was a lot of communication or like control in that aspect. But it's different in the case of Antiochus IV, because even though in his regional coinage you can see you can see a difference between the conquered places or the conquered regions in Celesyria and Phoenicia, where they saw galleys and ships, which were never really, there was really never a very important aspect of sea related coinage in the Seleukid history up until that time. Like that was most left for example, Demetrius Poliorcetes, who is gonna be showing a lot of Poseidon imagery. So you can see in the Phoenician mints of the time of Antiochus IV, they are gonna keep minting bronze coins of ships, and I think also the tige, which I remember about those coins after the last session we had the last month. But the difference is that those are gonna be all mainly minted in bronze, which is like for local exchanges and just your everyday Spain bread and whatever. The difference with Cilicia, which is a very hot spot and very important place for Antiochus IV, because he just wanted that region to stay loyal for the time, is that the coins that show the local aspects or like the local traditions of the people of Cilicia are going to be minted in silver instead of in bronze. And this is not like a little addition of the horse of Ecbatana or the diadem in the case of Antiochus I. This is literally completely breaking with the images of the Seleukids. For example, we have the type I was talking about earlier, which is like the Sandan and the funerary pyre monument of the Sandan, which is basically a Cilician Heracles. And even if we have Heracles coinage in the Seleukid history, you can see the difference is quite astonishing with the rest of the Seleukid coinage, is showing a symbol that would have never been used by the Seleukids before that, and is literally alluding to a festivity of the time. So it's like if, I don't know, it's like if Hawaiian people would mint a coin with a fire. How do you call these things they throw in the 4th of July? The fire. I don't know, you know what they throw in the 4th of July. I don't know the word right now, but it's like, it's just, they are celebrating a festivity and they are minting it in their coins. So there is a big difference between the regional additions of before Antiochus IV, which is just, the horse or the diadem or whatever, just putting little details into what is already a very recognizable type, in comparison to the Antiochus IV coinage in Cilicia, which are literally breaking completely with the imagery of the Seleukids. And in my mind, they showed the coins with the coins to Antiochus, maybe a sample or something, and he maybe decided that those weren't that bad and really didn't need any micromanagement, because again he just wanted to give some sort of autonomy to Cilicia, because he wanted to go forth and reconquer the east, and well, prior to that, conquer the Ptolemaic regions of Celesyria. So yeah, in my mind, the difference is the fact that it's a complete breaking from the previous coinages, instead of just adding some things, and like the range of the level of communication would have been variable at best most of the times. Most of the times, I guess the king just passively nodded, or maybe a official nodded and just said go for it, but I don't think there was a lot of control over the little variations of the coinage. But probably the the general type was devised and created in the court instead of just coming out of nowhere. Or at least I would hope so. Otherwise, my entire PhD is a lot of nonsense. So.
No, I think that makes sense. Thank you very much for these additional explanations. So, well, I think this is now a good time to thank you overall for this very stimulating presentation and discussion. And you've made us all curious to wait for your book, which will certainly be a great advancement in the field. Thank you very much. Thank you also, Deirdre, for the feedback and stimulating our discussion. Thanks you, everyone else, for joining, and you will be very welcome to stay in touch also with César if you have any further feedback. If anyone else wants to say some final words while I'm trying to end the recording. Here it is. So I end here the recording.